Chapter 10 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Don Will, Oakland, California. Chapter 10. Again United. The lightning flashed brightly. The sea, roaring loudly and wildly, dashed over them, seeming angry at being disappointed of its prey, as the two midshipmen climbed along the mast, till reaching the very cap of the topmast, they found that it rested on a small rock. Here all the English were collected, including the sick men who had been helped along the mast by their messmates. They soon found, however, that the sea broke over the greater portion of the rock, and that even the highest part was wet and slippery with the spray. It also was evident that the wreck considerably broke the fury of the seas, and that when she went to pieces the rock would be untenable. No one, however, felt inclined to fold his hands to rest. At length Hemming said that he thought he saw something dark on the opposite side of the rock, and that he observed when the sea washed up it came surging back, as it does between two rocks, and that thus he hoped there might be a larger one farther on. They had contrived happily to get hold of the topgallant halyards. Unreeving them, Hemming fastened one end round his waist, and ordered the men to hold the other, while he felt his way across the seeming gulf. Jack and Adair strained their eyes eagerly after him as he disappeared in the pitchy darkness among the roaring waters. On he went, they gradually paying out the rope. Suddenly it slackened, and with horror they felt that he was being carried off by the hungry waves. They were about to haul in the rope to try to save his life, when once more it straightened, and he seemed to be proceeding as before. At last they felt that the end was being lifted up, and all the slack hauled in. They fancied also that they heard his voice shouting to them, but it came to the teeth of the wind, and they could not understand what was said. "I will go over and learn what he wants," cried Jack, guessing that he wished them to join him. Jack, as he spoke, seized the rope, and grasping it tightly, worked his way on, till he found himself surrounded by the foaming sea, as it dashed through a passage which he saw evidently separated two rocks. More than once he was plunged over head and ears, but on he went wading among the rugged rocks, and every instant expecting to be carried off his legs. Often he had to stop to recover his breath. Once he was completely off his legs, and had to float on his back, while he worked his way along by the rope. At length he reached the side of a large rock, and by the fact of the lichens growing out of its crevices he knew that he must be above the reach of the waves. In another minute he found himself alongside Mr. Hemming, who congratulated him on getting safe across. They shouted to the other people to join them, but their voices were drowned by the noise of the tempest. At last Jack begged that he might go and hurry them over, and argued that as he was the slightest of the two, he should run less risk of being carried away. Jack seized the rope, and in spite of the waves which washed over him, by stopping every now and then and grasping it with all his might, he succeeded in returning to the spot where his shipmates were collected. Some of the Spanish officers and men were also on the rock, though others were on the forecastle of the brig, and a few still clung to the shattered poop. At that moment a tremendous sea knocked the poop to pieces, and sent most of the wretches who clung to it to destruction, a few only reaching the rock. "Come, Adair, now is your time to cross," cried out Jack. "Quick, quick!" Jack, seizing Terence's hand, guided him to the rope. Terence crossed without much difficulty, Dick Needham and the rest following with their sick comrades. Jack brought up the rear, but a sea caught him, and he had to hold on like grim death to save himself. Dick and another man had, just before they left the wreck, snatched up a couple of muskets. They had both once been cast away among savages, when they had felt the want of arms to defend themselves. The first faint streaks of daylight were appearing in the sky when the Englishmen found themselves assembled on the top of the rock. No sooner did the Spaniards ascertain where they had got, than they made a rush to follow, their officers and men indiscriminately crowding over, shoving each other aside, and all trying to be first. The consequence was that numbers were washed away and drowned. Hemming's first care was to ascertain the condition of his own people. None were much hurt. The 2 sick men had been brought over in their blankets. These were spread out in the air, where they quickly dried, and the poor fellows were then wrapped up in them again and placed in the most sheltered spot on the top of the rock. In the meantime the after part of the brig had gone to pieces, and the foot of the rock was strewn with a vast number of things sent up by the waves. Among them, unfortunately, was a cask of spirits which had come out of the hold. The Spanish seamen quickly discovered it, and in spite of all their captain and officers could do, they insisted on broaching it. Often British seamen have done the same, but there have been numerous instances where, without uttering a word of complaint, a crew have seen casks of spirits started by their officers that they might not have the opportunity of getting drunk. At first the Spaniards were quiet enough, till they produced some leathern cups and rapidly passed the liquor round. The officers no longer attempted to exert any control, and some even sat down and drank with the men. How desolate was the scene on every side of the barren rock on which the Englishmen stood! Below them were groups of men, many of them already half drunk, sitting round the cask of liquor only just above the wash of the sea. The shore was strewn with fragments of the wreck, with casks, chests, furniture, sails, and rigging, and with mangled bodies, many of whom might probably have been saved had their comrades exerted themselves. On the small rock a few wretches were still collected, the sea every instant breaking over them. Now one and now another would be washed away, while scarcely one made an attempt to save himself. The bow of the brig still held together. On it were collected some dozen men or more. Having hitherto found it a place of safety, they seemed afraid to quit it, while on the sea around fragments of the wreck and broken spars were floating, a few poor fellows clinging to them and crying for help to those who could afford them none. A dull grey sky was overhead, and as far as the eye could reach, the ocean seemed a mass of white foam, increasing the dreariness of the view, while in the far distance appeared a blue line so faint that many doubted whether or not it was the land. On the rock not a blade of grass nor a drop of water was to be found, so Hemming saw that it would be necessary to use every exertion to provide for his men. Accordingly he sent Jack and Adair with 3 of them to collect what things they could pick up at the foot of the rock. Fortunately they discovered 4 small breakers of water, and a couple of casks of salt meat with a bag of bread. These they dragged to the top of the rock, hoping to conceal them from the Spaniards. Unhappily the latter caught sight of the casks of water, and fancying that they contained brandy, came hurrying up to get them into their power. In spite of all Jack and Adair could do, one was broached, and the invaluable contents recklessly spilt on the ground. Still the Spaniards, unconvinced that the others only contained water, advanced with threatening gestures towards the English. Needham grasped his musket. Mr. Hemming seized another, and made signs that if they approached nearer, they would blow out the brains of a couple of them at all events. This made those in advance of the rest hesitate, for they did not remember that the muskets had been thoroughly wetted and could not go off. The Spanish officers generally sided with the English, and tried to explain that, as there was no water on the rock, all would be suffering from thirst, and that therefore the contents of the casks were more precious than any spirits. That may be the case, but then those hated Englishmen shall not boast that they prevented us from doing what we intended, exclaimed one of them, rushing to seize a cask. Hemming waited till the fellow got within reach of his fist, and he then hit him such a blow on the chest that he sent him rolling back head over heels till he reached the edge of the rock, when down he went among a group of his comrades who were sitting carousing together below. Each of the Englishmen singled out an opponent, and treated him much in the same way. All this time many of the Spanish officers standing by and not attempting to interfere. The Spanish seamen, finding that nothing was to be obtained but hard knocks, retreated to secure their share of the liquor. Often had Jack and Adair cast their eyes round the horizon, in the hopes of discovering a sail by which they might escape from the rock, but none appeared. Meantime hunger was pressing. The head of one of the meat casks was knocked off, and the biscuits were spread out to dry. In vain they tried to light a fire. There was plenty of driftwood, but it was too wet, so they had to eat the meat raw. Their appetites were thus quickly satisfied. At first the sky gave indications of an improvement in the weather, but by noon it came on to blow as hard as ever. They made all the signals they could devise to induce the people who still remained on the wreck to quit it, but they soon found, by the wretches' frantic gestures and maniacal shouts, that they also had got hold of a cask of spirits, and were in as bad a condition as their comrades. They were soon indeed seen snapping their fingers, and dancing about the decks as if they were in a place of perfect safety. One poor wretch slipped overboard, but his companions, instead of trying to help him, only laughed and shouted the louder. Nor did they appear to comprehend that he was drowning before their eyes. A few remained on the small rock. Every now and then one would carelessly get within the influence of the seas, and several were thus swept away. The larger part of the crew, who had been carousing at the foot of the big rock, soon began to dispute with each other. Their voices grew higher and higher, their actions more vehement. Knives at last were drawn, and one lay a corpse by the side of his companions. This act of violence, instead of sobering the rest, induced another to take up the quarrel, and another joining, in a short time the greater portion were engaged in a deadly hand-to-hand struggle. The officers contented themselves with merely shouting and ordering them to desist, and of course their commands received no attention. In a few minutes several of the combatants lay weltering in their blood, and two of them, locked in a deadly embrace in each other's arms, fell off the rock into the sea, and a huge wave rolling in washed them both away. The gale was increasing. The wreck rocked to and fro. Large portions were constantly being detached and hove against the rock. At length a sea heavier than any of the preceding ones came roaring in. It struck the wreck. High over it the foaming waters rushed, the spray from it almost blinding Hemming and his companions. Far above it as they stood, a piercing shriek reached their ears. The squall passed by. They looked towards the spot where the brig had been. Not a particle was to be seen hanging together. Not one of those clinging to it escaped. This catastrophe appeared to have no effect on the other Spaniards. Even when a sea came and washed away several of those who had remained on the lower rock, the rest went on quarrelling and shouting and shrieking as before. Sometimes, without any apparent reason, a wretched man would throw himself off the rock, when he was soon swept out of sight by the retiring sea. Some rolled off helplessly drunk into the water and were washed away. Hemming and his companions would have helped them had they been able, but their own countrymen would not allow the English to interfere, and they were compelled to desist. They felt, indeed, all the time, that those who held their own lives so cheap were not likely to pay any respect to theirs. While watching with painful interest the scenes which have been described, they observed a cask, drifting towards the rock. The Spaniards saw it also. Adair, with Needham and 3 other men, hurried down to secure it. The Spaniards rushed to the spot at the same moment, and 2 of them, in their eagerness to obtain the coveted prize, for they of course believed it to contain spirits, fell headlong into a surging sea, which, sweeping out again, carried them both far away. Adair meantime got hold of the cask, and was in triumph bearing it up the rock, when the Spaniards surrounded him, and though Dick and the other men fought most desperately, succeeded in carrying it off. The effect of the fresh supply of fire-water was most disastrous. The Spaniards became almost raving mad, and excited to fury by the opposition they had encountered from the English, now drawing their knives, advanced once more in a body towards them. Some even of the Spanish officers joined them. Others, however, stood surrounding their captain, but seemed inclined to take no part in the fray. "Are you going to see us murdered before your eyes, gentlemen?" exclaimed Hemming with indignation. "If they murder us, they will murder you, depend on that." The appeal had an effect, and drawing their swords, the Spanish captain and his superior officers sided with the English. On rushed the infuriated Spaniards, uttering the fiercest oaths and threats of vengeance. Fortunately, besides the 2 muskets, many of the English had knives, and all had provided themselves with boat stretchers, or pieces of spars, which served the purpose of single sticks. They were thus not ill prepared to meet their assailants. The shock came. Headed by Lieutenant Hemming, they stood firm. One of the first victims was a young Spanish officer. He fell pierced to the heart by the knife of one of his countrymen. It showed the Spanish officers that their safety depended on that of the English. Again and again the infuriated wretches rushed at them, but were beaten off by the English quarterstaves. All this time the wind had been howling, and the sea dashing fiercely against the rocks. Indeed, the elements were in perfect accordance with the mad strife going forward on that isolated spot of earth. Night, too, came on to add to the horrors of the scene. Then the clouds opened, and flashes of the most vivid lightning, darting from the sky, played like fiery serpents round the rock, while crashing peals of thunder rattled and roared around them. At first the seamen took no notice of the storm. Then came a loud thundering explosion, and 2 of their number lay blackened corpses on the ground. In an instant, seeing what had occurred, they fled with shrieks of dismay down the rock to the spot whence they had come. Amid wind and rain, the lightning flashing and the thunder roaring, the survivors passed that terrific night. The day dawned at last. Hemming's first resolve was to try and conciliate the unfortunate wretches by offering them food. Their officers gladly agreed to the proposal. The sun came out, the driftwood dried, and at last a fire was kindled. The Spanish officers were far superior to the English in the art of cooking. They made hot cakes out of the wet biscuit, and in a short time had a number of nice-looking little bits of meat ran upon wooden skewers. Having satisfied their own hunger, they offered the food to the men below, who at first thought that they were mocking them, but when assured that the Englishmen were willing to forget what had passed, one by one came up with a sulky and doubting manner to take what was offered to them. "I doubt those fellows even now," observed Adair. "The sooner we are away from them the better." Hemming, hearing this, observed that he proposed making a raft, and in spite of all they had undergone, venturing on it to the coast of Africa, which he was confident was visible to the eastward. It was agreed, therefore, that they would set about building it at once, and should no sail appear in sight, push off as soon as it was completed. On the east side of the rock was a bay sheltered from the view of the other part. Here a number of spars and planks were driven in, as well as rope and canvas. Hemming thus had soon a raft constructed capable of carrying twice as many men as wished to trust themselves on it. He also had a supply of provisions and water carried down to it without being observed by the drunken seamen. When all was ready, he invited the Spanish officers to accompany them, but they declined, saying that they could not leave their men, though from the glances they cast on the raft, it was evident that they did not wish to entrust themselves on it. They, however, did not object to the Englishmen taking the water and provisions, the latter promising that if they got safe to any European settlement, they would send them assistance. "Now, my lads, we'll launch our raft," exclaimed Hemming, when all their arrangements were made. The Spaniards had not been aware of the nature of their proceedings, but unfortunately 2 or 3 of the more sober, who had begun to scramble about the rock, caught sight of them. Believing naturally that they were about to make off with the provisions and water, summoning their comrades, they rushed fiercely towards them. "Now, my boys, a hearty shove all together, and we'll have the raft into the water before the scoundrels can come up to us," shouted Hemming, setting an example by putting all his strength to the work. The Spanish seamen, brandishing their knives, were close to them. "One shove more, and the raft will be afloat," cried Jack. "Hurrah, hurrah, she's afloat," sang out Terence. Their 2 sick shipmates were speedily placed in the center of the raft, and the rest leaped onto it. The Spaniards were close to them. One seized a rope which still held the raft to the shore. Quick as thought, Hemming took one of the paddles they had prepared, and springing on shore, used it with such good effect that he drove the wretches back before him. Then, leaping again onto the raft, he shoved it a dozen yards off from the shore. As the Englishmen vigorously plied their paddles, they saw the Spaniards making all sorts of frantic gestures at them, shaking their fists and hurling abuse at their heads. When they got from under the lee of the rock, they hoisted sail and found that the raft steered very well, and with the aid of the paddles made good way towards the land. Gradually the rock sank lower and lower in the horizon, till it was almost hid from sight, but when they looked towards the shore, that appeared almost as far off as ever. They had hoped to reach it before sunset, but that hope gradually faded away, as the breeze which had hitherto favored them grew less and less, and finally sank into a calm. However, that was better than a gale, and they could still paddle on their raft in the direction in which they wished to go. They were also far better off than they had been on their former raft. It was more strongly made, they had better provisions, and the prospect of reaching land in a short time. The sun, however, went down, and they were still far from it. Jack and Terence sat side by side, and endeavored to keep up each other's spirits during that long, long night. It came at last to an end. The sun rose, they looked round the horizon, no sail was in sight. Some of the seamen began to grumble, as even the best will at times, and to complain at having been enticed off the rock. Hemming overheard them. "What think you, my lads? Would have been our lot had we remained with those madmen," he said. "I'll tell you, by this time not one of us would have been alive." As the sun rose, the breeze came strongly off the land and drove them once more away from it. "Never fear, my lads, we shall have the sea breeze soon to send us back again," he cried out cheerfully to keep up their spirits. It did not come as soon as he expected. At last a rock appeared rising out of the water. It rose higher and higher. The raft drifted slowly by at a distance. Still, the atmosphere was so clear that they could discern figures on the top. They all looked earnestly. There could be no doubt of it. The people were struggling like madmen. Now and then one of them, it appeared, was cast off the cliff into the water, but the distance was so great that it appeared rather like some dreadful dream than a reality. While they were gazing at this spectacle, the wind fell. Then in a short time the breeze came from the west, and hoisting their sail, they once more rapidly approached the shore. For the remainder of the day they made good progress. Still they knew that they could not hope to reach it that night, and once more the sun went down and left them in darkness. The night passed as the former had done. No one now expressed a wish that he had remained on the rock. Jack and Terence had kept up their spirits wonderfully. At length, leaning on each other's shoulder, they fell asleep. They were startled with a cry of "A sail ahead!" In an instant everyone roused up. As they looked out, they saw a large brig on the port tack, standing to the southward across their course. In a few minutes more she would have shot ahead out of hearing. "Now, my lads, shout, shout, till you crack your voices," cried out Hemming. "She is a man-o'-war brig, one of the cruisers on the station. I know her by the cut of her canvas." Weak as all on board the raft at this time were, they raised a shout such as Englishmen only know how to give. They listened eagerly. Directly afterwards a cheer came in answer towards them. The rattling of blocks was heard, and the brig's helm being put down and her main topsail backed, she came up into the wind. In another instant they were alongside. Cramped and half-starved as they all had been, they had great difficulty in getting on board. Hemming was the only man who went up by himself, and his knees trembled so much when he gained the deck that he had to lean against the bulwarks for support. The officer of the watch came forward to receive them. Hemming gave his name as a lieutenant of the Ranger. "Delighted to see you," exclaimed the lieutenant of the brig. "We heard at Sierra Leone that you were lost, for several vessels have been sent to look for you, and not one could gain tidings of you. But come below, you want sleep and food and dry clothes." The captain of the brig, hearing what had occurred, turned out and had berths made up for the 2 midshipmen in his own cabin, while one of the lieutenants gave up his berth to Hemming in the gun-room. The doctor was soon in attendance on all the party, and sleep, which they all so much required, soon sealed their eyelids. Jack and Terence slept for a long time. When they awoke, the sun was shining right down the cabin skylight. At the cabin table was sitting a midshipman reading. They could not see his face, but there was something in his figure and attitude which made them both sit up and exclaim, "Hello! Who are you?" The midshipman sprang from his seat, and in another instant Alec Murray was shaking them warmly by the hand. "This is jolly, this is delightful," exclaimed Jack. "Tell us all about it, though." Alec accordingly told them that the brig was the Archer, of 16 guns, that she was commanded by a relation of his, Captain Grant, who had got him appointed to her, and that she had only just come out direct from England. Murray then got his friends to give him an outline of their adventures, which they had to repeat to Captain Grant himself, who shortly after came into the cabin. Meantime the steward had brought them some breakfast, for midshipmen are not heroes of romance, and require feeding before they are fit for much. After breakfast they felt wonderfully recovered, and were able to get up and go on deck. Hemming had before this explained to Captain Grant his promise to bring relief to the Spaniards, and the brig was accordingly beating up towards the rock. As they drew near they looked out for signals, but none were made. They got still nearer. "Where can the people have got to?" exclaimed the captain, looking through his glass. As the brig approached the rock, the lead was kept going, but the water was found to be quite deep. She sailed round and round it, but not a human being was seen there alive. Whether some dreadful catastrophe had occurred after the English left the spot, or whether some vessel had visited it and carried off the survivors, was never ascertained. Jack and Terence did their best to banish the dreadful scenes which had occurred from their thoughts. and it was with infinite satisfaction that the three midshipmen found themselves once more together. "This is the station for adventure," exclaimed Jack. "Depend on it, before long we shall have lots to do." End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 11. Life on an African Cruiser. That naval officers do not idle away their time when at sea, on beds of roses, the adventure of my three old schoolfellows will, I think, convince all my readers. Who would have thought when we were together at dear old Eagle House that they would, ere many years had gone over their heads, have actually crossed swords with real red-capped or turbaned Mohammedans, fought with true Greek romantic pirates, hunted down slavers, and explored African rivers, with voracious sharks watching their mouths, hungry crocodiles basking in their slimy shadows, and veritable negroes inhabiting their banks. Yet here were all the three, Alex Murray, Jack Rogers, and Terence Adair, collected on board Her Majesty's brig of war, Archer, commanded by Captain Grant. Alick had come out in the brig from England. The other two, after being shipwrecked, nearly drowned, murdered and starved, eaten up by sharks, and having undergone I do not know how many other terrible dangers, had at last been picked up by the Archer, their own ship, the Ranger frigate being they did not exactly know where. This last circumstance did not probably weigh very much with them. Midshipmen are not generally given to suffer from over-anxiety from affairs terrestrial, but Rogers certainly did wish that he could let his family know that he was well, and pick up again after having, as was supposed, gone down in a slaver the frigate had captured off the African coast. They were capital fellows, those three old friends of mine. Rogers was a good specimen of the Englishman. Genus Middy, so was Paddy Adair of Green Erin Isle, full of fun and frolic, and a more gentlemanly, right-minded lad than Alick Murray. Scotland never sent forth from her rich valleys or rugged mountains. He too was proud of Scotland, and ever jealous to uphold the name and fame of the land of his birth. The Archer was a fine brig, and Captain Grant was a first-rate officer. When naval officers or seamen go on board ships of war, they have to take their share of the duty with the rest of the crew. So Rogers and Adair found that they should have plenty of employment, even though they might not for some time be able to join their own ship. Captain Grant considered that idleness is the mother of all vice, so he took care that no one in his ship should be idle, and certainly he had the knack of making good seamen of all who sailed with him. The midshipmen's berth in the Archer was a very happy place, because the occupants were, with few exceptions, gentlemanly, well disposed, and, more than all, well and religiously educated young men. I do not mean to say by that they always acted with the wisdom and discretion of a bench of judges. Far from that. They were merry, light-hearted fellows, full of fun and frolic, but they could be grave and treat serious things as they ought to be treated, with reverence and respect. Jack and Paddy quickly found themselves perfectly at home among them. The Archer had been standing off the coast of Africa under easy sail, when, just as the cold grey light of day stole over the waters, a vessel was seen inside of her. evidently making for a harbour in the neighbourhood. As the light increased, she was discovered to be a schooner. "All hands make sail," cried the officer of the watch, who had just made his report to the commander. "All hands make sail," echoed the boatswain, giving with his shrill pipe the well-known signal. "Tumble up there, tumble up there," roared out the boatswain's mates, with their gruff voices, to the sluggards who seemed inclined to stick in their hammocks. In a few moments the watch below were rushing up on deck and flying to their stations, and then, as if by magic, the masts and yards of the brig were covered with the broad sheets of canvas which had been furled during the night. Topgallant sails, royals, and studding sails being set in rapid succession, away glided the brig with her head towards the land, through the calm, leaden-coloured water. Jack and Terence had with the rest sprung on deck, not taking many moments to slip into their clothes. Few landsmen can understand how quickly that operation can, by constant practice, be performed. They had there joined Alex, who had the morning watch. Together they all went aloft to take a look at the chase. "She's a slaver, from her evident wish to avoid us, and from the way she is standing," observed Alick, after having taken a long look at her through his glass. "We may prevent her from embarking her slaves, and save the poor wretches the horrors to which they are always exposed, when once they get on board these iniquitous prison ships. To look down on the slave deck crowded with human beings is quite sufficient to make a man abhor slavery for ever after, and to desire to put an end, with all his might, to the system which can produce such horrors." Jack and Adair agreed that they should have great satisfaction in capturing or destroying every slaver on the coast. The strangers soon discovered that the brig of war was in chase of her, and having crowded all sail, kept away directly for the land. From the wide spread of her white canvas, and from the way she had behaved, there was no doubt she was a slaver. Everybody felt certain that they should capture the stranger. The Archer was undoubtedly overhauling her, and she could not escape either to the north or south without their perceiving her, and cutting her off. An hour's chase brought them in sight of the land. It was a low, uninviting shore, lined with a dense belt of mangrove bushes, a few tall palms appearing here and there above them. Then the ground rose slightly, with some ranges of blue hills in the distance. As the sun rose, a mist was drawn up which floated just above the water, and shut out the lower branches of the mangrove trees, though their tops, forming a wavy dark line, could just be seen above it. None of the officers of the Archer had been on the coast before, and as she had no pilot, it was necessary to approach it with caution. The lead was therefore kept going. The schooner stood boldly on. "The fellows will, I'm afraid, run her on shore, if they can't find no other means of escaping," observed the captain, after scrutinising the chase and the coast she was approaching through his glass. "We shall have her. She can't escape us, that's one comfort," cried Jack Rogers. On flew the schooner. The wind freshened somewhat. Suddenly she entered the belt of mist. Everybody on board the brig rubbed their eyes. Where was she? Not a vestige of her was to be seen. As they approached the land, the roar of the surf on the shore reached their ears. There could be little doubt that the schooner had been run on the shore, and would probably soon be knocked to pieces. While her crew had made their escape to the land, Captain Grant was anxious to stand in as close as he could. "By the deep nine," sang out one of the men in the chains. "By the mark 7, soon," repeated another. To approach nearer would not have been prudent. The canvas was therefore flattened in, and the brig's head was once more turned to seaward. Scarcely had she hauled her wind, than the sun having risen high above the land, the mist lifted, and the whole line of coast fringed with mangrove bushes, and here and there with a white belt of sand, appeared in sight. But the chase, where was she? Not a sign of her appeared on the shore, while neither to the north nor to the south was she to be seen. Jack looked at Adair, and Adair looked at Jack, and together they discussed the matter with Alick. But neither of the three could offer any satisfactory explanation of the matter. Captain Grant and the rest of the officers appeared equally puzzled. As the brig stood closer inshore, there was a chance of the mystery being solved. The hands in the chains were kept heaving the lead, which showed that the brig was slowly shoaling her water. At length she was to have to, and two boats were lowered. Their own Lieutenant Hemming, who had escaped with them from a sinking slaver, volunteered to take charge of one of them, and Evans, the second lieutenant of the brig, went in the other. The former, as the senior officer, had charge of the expedition. As she cannot have escaped along shore, and certainly has not evaporated into the air, the chase must have got into some creek or inlet, the mouth of which we cannot distinguish, observed the captain. You will therefore search for such an entrance, and pursue and bring her out if you can. Aye, aye, sir, answered Hemming, delighted with the work in prospect. The three midshipmen got leave to go in the boat. Jack accompanied Evans, the other two went with Hemming, as did Jack's old follower, Dick Needham. Away they pulled in high spirits. As they approached the shore, they observed that a long line of white surf was breaking heavily on it. Hemming stood up and scanned the coast narrowly, thinking that after all the schooner must have been run on shore, and, as slavers are but slightly put together, might have speedily been knocked to pieces. As he stood up, and the boat rose to the top of the swell, he saw not what he expected, but a piece of clear water inside a narrow spit of sand, and a little to the south he observed a spot where the surf broke less heavily, and which he concluded was the entrance to the creek or river. I have little doubt that this must be the place where the schooner has taken refuge, and as soon as she's gone up, so may we, shouted Hemming, pointing it out to his brother officer. Evans agreed with him, and the two boats pulled away in the direction indicated. That there was an entrance was evident, but it required great caution in approaching it. A capsize would probably prove fatal to all hands, for had any escaped drowning, they would have fallen a prey to the sharks, which in southern latitudes generally maintain a strict blockade at the mouths of rivers, to pick up any offal which the stream may bring down. The boats rose and fell on the smooth swells as they came rolling in. At last Hemming observed a space on the bar clear of broken water. He gave the signal to go ahead. "Now, my lads, now pull away," he shouted. The boats dashed on, the surf roared and foamed on either side of them, and not only did the three midshipmen, but most of the older men in the boats, hold their breath till they were well through it, and once more floating in smooth water inside the bar. Instead of being in a mere creek, they found that they had entered a broad deep river, which seemed to come down from a considerable distance in the interior. They pulled on more certain than before of finding the chase. However, after they had gone some distance, they arrived at a spot where the river formed two distinct branches, or, rather, it might be, where another broad stream joined the main current. Up which the schooner had proceeded it was impossible to say. "I'll take one stream, you take the other," shouted Hemming to Evans, and the boats dashed on. It was important to overtake the schooner before she got higher up, and perhaps hidden away in some narrow creek where it might be no easy matter to find her. The scenery was far from attractive. Little else on either side was to be seen but long lines of mangrove bushes, and as the tide fell, black banks of mud began to appear, which it was evident would soon narrow the width of the stream. Evans and Jack took the branch of the stream which came from the southward. It wound about a good deal, so that they were aware that they might any moment come on the schooner. They kept their muskets by their side, ready loaded. "I say, Mr. Evans, I wish that we could see the chase some time before we get up to her," observed Jack. "What are we to do should we find her, sir?" "Jump on board and knock every fellow down who resists," was the lieutenant's answer. "Depend on it, she is a slaver or pirate, probably both, and her crew will not give in without a tussle." "With the greatest pleasure in the world," replied Jack, who was very practical in his notions about fighting, and had no idea of half measures. The current was now making down very strong, and the boat consequently progressed but slowly. Still Mr. Evans persevered. The men bent lustily to their oars, and reach after reach of the river was passed, but there was no sign of the chase. Now and then there were openings in the mangrove bushes, and more than once Jack felt certain that he saw some dark figures running along parallel with the river, and evidently watching their movements. Jack pointed them out to Mr. Evans. "That looks as if we had enemies in the neighbourhood," observed the lieutenant. "Be ready, my men. Marines, look to your arms." The boat pulled 8 oars, and there were 2 marines in the bows, and 2 in the stern sheets, sitting with their muskets between their knees. In the bows of the boat was a small swivel gun, and all the bluejackets with cutlasses and pistols. Besides the lieutenant and Jack, there was a coxswain, and there were some half-dozen long pikes, which, as the latter observed, would come in handy if they had a fight with another boat or had to attack a fort, but for boarding he would not give a rush for them. The ebb tide rushed past the boat, dark and smooth, but with swirling eddies, which showed the strength of the current against which they had to contend. "I wonder whether the other boat has fallen in with the slaver. I envy them if they have," observed Jack, who didn't much like being silent just then. There was something very oppressive in the atmosphere, and in the dark solemn scenery which surrounded them. The sea breeze had by this time set in and blew up the river, but it had not yet been strong enough to make it worth while to hoist the sail. "I scarcely think the schooner could have got up so far as this," observed Mr. Evans, "but we will pull on a little farther, and then if we do not see her, we will go back and join the other boat." They had just then arrived at the end of a reach. The extent of the next one was hidden from their sight by a point of land thickly covered with trees. They pulled on and soon doubled the point. Directly they did so, there appeared before them, pressing up the stream under all sail, the object of their search. The men required no urging, but, bending to their oars, away they pulled in hot chase after her. The schooner stood on steadily, as if no one on board was aware of the presence of the boat of a British man of war. The boat rapidly came up with her. As they drew near, Jack remarked that her decks were crowded with a very ill-looking set of ruffians, but he cared little for that, and he knew that every man in the boat would be ready to attack even twice as many as there were there. They had to go up to within 100 yards of the schooner without any notice being taken of them. "Give way, my lads, we'll be alongside in a moment," shouted the lieutenant. Scarcely had he uttered the words when a couple of guns were ran out at the schooner's stern ports, and a shower of langrage, nails, bits of iron, lead, and missiles of all sorts came rattling among them, accompanied by a volley of musketry. One or two of the seamen and one of the marines were hit, but the boat pulled on as fast as before. "Marines, give it to the scoundrels," cried Mr. Evans. The red jackets, turning round, deliberately picked off several of the people who had fired at them. They had scarcely time to load again before the boat was alongside the schooner, and the seamen, cutlasses in hand, began to scramble up on her decks. Pikes were poked out at them, pistols were flashed in their faces, and cold shot hove into their boat. But fiercely as the pirates fought, they could not prevent the British seamen from gaining the deck of their vessel. Desperate was the struggle which took place there. Both parties fought for their lives. The English knew that they would receive no quarter. The pirates did not expect it either. Jack was soon knocked down, but he got up again with a somewhat ugly gash on his arm, and went at it as hard as ever. At length Mr. Evans and his men gained the after part of the vessel, and were thus able to command her movements. But the pirates still clustered thickly in the bows, and were evidently preparing to make a rush aft. The English had left their boats, which was alongside, with her painter made fast to the forechains. This was an oversight. The pirates perceived it, hauled her ahead, and instead of attempting to regain their vessel, the greater number, jumping into her, made off, leaving 4 or 5 of their companions in the hands of the British. These few threw down their arms and sang out for quarter. This was granted them, little as they deserved it. Meantime the rest of the pirates pulled away for the shore, and were soon concealed from view behind a wooded point. "See the cable ranged, to bring up, Mr. Rogers," was the first order given by the lieutenant. "Aye, aye, sir," answered Jack, but he found that he could not obey the order, as there were neither cables nor anchors on board. It was therefore necessary to keep the vessel under way, and to endeavour to beat down the river. Had the English known the channel, this might have been a more easy task than it was likely to prove. They were obliged to make very short tacks for fear of getting on shore, and in whatever reach they were, the wind always seemed to head them, so that their progress, notwithstanding the strong current in their favour, was but slow. Their victory had not been gained without considerable loss. A marine had been killed, and 3 other men besides Jack had been wounded, 2 of them so badly that they were unable to help in working the vessel. This made Mr. Evans not a little anxious, and he kept looking out ahead in the hopes of seeing the other boat coming to his assistance. Jack also, who never failed to make good use of his eyes, was not altogether comfortable, for he had observed in the openings where he had before seen people a much greater number, evidently keeping a watch on the movements of the schooner. As soon as she could be kept moving, there was no great cause for fear, but should she get on the mud, it was difficult to say what might happen. Jack was stationed forward. At length the schooner entered a reach which ran nearly north and south, and the wind enabled her to lay nearly down it. "No sign of the boat yet, Mr. Rogers," sang out Mr. Evans from aft. "No, sir," answered Jack, "but there are a number of dark objects in the water which look remarkably like canoes. They seem to be waiting for us at the end of the reach, where we must go about. We must run some of them down, and give the rest a taste of the pirates' guns," replied Mr. Evans. The guns were got forward, but neither shot nor powder was to be found. Still undaunted, the seamen and marines stood ready to receive the expected attack. Things looked serious. Jack soon made out not less than 20 canoes full of men, with a couple of large boats so posted that it would be impossible to avoid them. The schooner was but a very little way from the junction of the two rivers, and the other boat might come to her assistance. But her best chance of escaping was by getting a strong breeze, so that she might dash past the fleet of canoes before they could manage to catch hold of her. There was a prospect of this. The wind had for some time been blowing in fitful gusts, and now it came down on them stronger than ever. To shorten sail was out of the question, but in another minute Jack and his companions found that they had more than a little vessel could well stagger under. That was all right, though. On she flew towards their enemies. "Why, there is our boat among them," exclaimed Jack. "She must have got down by some other channel. We shall have a hard tussle for it." The critical moments were approaching. They could already see the faces of their enemies, and most villainous looking ruffians they were. Many of them were blacks, but there were several white men among them. "Steady, my lads, now. Don't throw a shot away until they attack us," sang out Mr. Evans. "Stand by to go about." Down went the helm. The jib was shivering in the breeze. A loud shout aroused from the canoes and boats, and, making a dash at the schooner, many of the villains began clambering up on each quarter. At that moment a violent gust coming down between an opening in the trees struck the vessel. It was not a moment to start sheet or tack. Every one, indeed, was engaged in the desperate conflict with their assailants. Jack was rushing forward to drive back some fellows who had just hooked on their canoe at the lee fore chains. The marines were thrusting away with their bayonets. A huge mulatto had grasped Mr. Evans by the throat, and several of the seamen were grappling with their opponents. Overheeled the vessel. Just as she was in midstream, another gust, more furious than the first, struck her. In an instant Jack felt that she had gone over, not to rise again. He scrambled up over the bulwarks into the weather chains, where he hung on while the rest of the combatants, English, pirates, and negroes, participated into the rapidly running stream. 2 or 3 of the canoes were swamped. Some of the blacks swam to the other canoes and were picked up, but numbers of the combatants, grappling with each other, went down in the dark, whirling stream, their shouts, cries, and struggles quieted only by the water which closed over their heads. Jack climbed up to the bottom of the vessel and looked round. His heart sank within him. Where was his late gallant comrades, Mr. Evans and the rest? Not one remained. The capsized schooner was drifting rapidly down the stream. Jack, however, found that he was not alone, but he would gladly have dispensed with his companions. 2 blacks had hung on by their leather chains, and now, as they climbed up, they caught sight of them. Their eyes flashed vindictively. They had their knives in their belts, but no other weapons. He had retained his grasp on his cutlass, and he had a pistol in his belt, but he feared that the priming must have got wet. The blacks began to creep slowly towards him. They grinned horribly, and were evidently intent on his destruction. Jack saw that he had not the slightest prospect of escape, and must depend entirely on his own exertions. He had no notion, however, of giving in. The schooner rapidly drifted away from the place where she upset, and none of the canoes were following her. Jack grasped firm hold of the keel of the vessel, while he held his weapons in his hands ready for action. Fortunately the blacks could only move on by following each other. They shouted to him in fierce, rough tones, but what they said he could not understand. He was not alarmed, but he held his pistol very tight. The ruffian got close to him. Jack cocked and presented his pistol. If it missed, he had his cutlass ready. The negro smiled, or rather grinned. He thought the pistol would not go off. Jack pulled the trigger. The negro fell over and over down the side of the vessel into the water. He tried to swim and to regain his lost hold, but his strength failed him, and, with a cry of disappointed rage, he sank under the tide, a small circle of ruddy hue marking the spot where he had gone down. Jack had not, however, a moment to think about this. He had just time to grasp his cutlass in his right hand before his enemy made a spring on him. Jack was still only a boy, though a good stout one, but his nerves were well strung and his muscles were strong. He swung his cutlass round with all his might till the blade met the neck and shoulders of the black, and over he went into the water, where he at once sank, without even attempting to strike out for his life. Indeed, Jack's blow had almost severed his head from his body. A very short time had been occupied in this encounter. Still the schooner had drifted down some way, and neither the pirates nor their allies seemed inclined to follow her. Notwithstanding this, Jack's position was far from a pleasant one. If the vessel drifted on to either bank of the river, he would probably be murdered, and if she continued in the stream, she would soon be among the heavy breakers on the bar, where he would, in all probability, be washed off and devoured by the sharks. With straining eyes he looked out for Hemming's boat, but she was nowhere to be seen. He soon drifted past the channel up which she had gone. Not a sign of her could he perceive. On drifted the schooner. The channel must be very deep, he knew, or the mast must have struck in the bottom. Should this latter happen, he was afraid that the current gathering round her would speedily wash him off his hold. He felt very grave and sad, and though he was certainly not afraid, he could not help being aware that the life he had found so pleasant and so cheerful, and to which he had so many ties, was slipping away from him. The courage of an older man might well have given way. Jack sighed deeply, but his courage did not give way, for he said to himself, "God's will be done." In that feeling was his strength and support. I am in God's hands. He will preserve me if he thinks fit. On drifted the schooner. The current, strengthened by the additional stream, grew more rapid. The vessel kept in mid-channel. He might have gained nothing had she verged on either side, unless he could have got near enough to catch hold of a stout branch of some mangrove bush, where he might have hung on to it till the boat came by, when should anybody see him, he might be rescued, otherwise lingering and painful death would be his lot, instead of the speedy one he had every reason to expect. The roar of the breakers on the bar sounded mournfully on his ears. He could see the white surf dancing less high above the sandbank, and he knew that in a few minutes he might be among those roaring, hissing, raging breakers. He thought that he could see the white sails of the brig in the offing, but she was much too far off to render him the slightest assistance. There was, he thought, one chance more. The current might set against the sandpit which crossed its course, and if so, he might be washed on shore. He watched eagerly to ascertain if any logs or branches floating down took that direction. There was nothing to give him assurance of this. For a minute he thought that she was going towards the spit, but the current again seized her, and whirling her round, sent her driving rapidly onwards towards the boiling breakers. Jack felt the wreck rise and fall. He clutched firmly hold of the keel, useless as he believed it to be. The foaming waters sounded in his ears, the foam washed over him, and he knew that he was in that terrible bar, in the midst of the raging breakers. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by TJP 1421. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 12. Adventures on Shore. While Jack Rogers, with Lieutenant Evans and his unfortunate boat's crew, took the southern branch of the river, Mr. Hemming, with Murray and Adair, pulled away in the boat up the northern channel, each party believing that they were following the track of the schooner of which they were in search. On dashed Lieutenant Hemming's boat, the crew, as British seamen always will when work is to be done, bending bravely to their oars. They also, as had the other boat, met a strong current. "Hurrah, my lads, hurrah!" shouted the lieutenant, bending forward almost mechanically to give time to their strokes. "If the chase has gone up the channel, we must take care that she does not creep away from us, that is all." "Aye, aye, sir," answered Dick Needham. "No fear, but we'll hunt her up if she's above water." In a chase on shore, some signs discernible either by the eyes or the olfactory nerves are perceptible by which the pursuers may be guided. But the gallant seamen had only hope on this occasion to lead them on. That, however, was enough. The scenery of this branch was as monotonous as that of the other. Mangrove bushes, with a few tall palms appearing over them, lined the banks, and here and there an opening left blank by nature, or perhaps made by the dark-skinned natives. "I wonder if, after all, the schooner did come up this way," observed Paddy Adair sagaciously. "If she went up the other, I don't think she could." His remark, of course, produced a laugh. No great amount of wit was required to do that. They looked about in every direction to discover someone from whom they might obtain information, but no one was seen. "It's not very likely the blackfellows would trouble themselves with telling us the truth, so it doesn't much matter," said Paddy. "They're all in league with the slavers, from the king who dresses up on great occasions in cocked hat, top boots, and an old blanket, to poor Quasho, who's never had his nakedness covered since he was born." Notwithstanding their want of success, still they perseveringly pulled on. Suddenly Murray put his hand on Adair's shoulder, pointing at the same time with the other. "I say, Terence, what do you see there at the end of the reach?" he asked. "Does it not look to you like the stern of a vessel?" "So like it that it must be one," said Hemming. "Hurrah! The slaver must be ours after all." Just at that moment the sound of firearms coming from a distance was heard, borne faintly on the wind through an opening in the mangrove bushes. Shot after shot followed. "The other boat must have fallen in with some of the rascals. The two channels cannot be far apart," exclaimed Mr. Hemming. "Give way, my lads, give way." He could not help in his eagerness saying this, although the men were already pulling as hard as they could. He was eagerly looking about all the time for some passage through which they might get to the assistance of their comrades. The boat dashed on up the river, and very soon they came in sight of a schooner moored close to the bank of a small creek. They were quickly up to her and mounting her sides. No one opposed them, and not a human being was to be seen. There were, however, evident signs that people had only just left her. A stage of planks led from her deck to the shore. Her sails were bent, her anchors stowed, she was in perfect readiness for sea. A hurried glance below showed that she was undoubtedly a slaver, and probably that very day to receive her human cargo on board. In her hold were leaguers, or huge water casks, filled with water, a large supply of wood and provisions, especially of farina, on which the slaves were chiefly fed. Then there was the slave deck, scarcely 36 inches in height, and large coppers for boiling the slaves' food, and some 100 pairs of slave irons or manacles for confining their legs or arms. Indeed, nothing was wanting to condemn her. Although Hemming guessed that the crew would soon be back, he was so eager to go to the assistance of Mr. Evans that, leaving Murray and a couple of men on board the schooner, he leaped again into his boat and pulled up the creek, thinking that he might get through it into the other channel. It narrowed, however, very rapidly. The trees grew closer and closer together till the branches touched, and finally arched so much overhead as to shut out the view of the sky. It was almost evident that there could not be a navigable passage into the other stream, and Hemming felt that he was not doing a prudent thing in thus pushing on into what might prove not only a hornet's nest, but a hornet's trap, where he and those whose lives were entrusted to him might be stung to death without the power of defending themselves. Still, he did not like to abandon his purpose. To push over land would be still more dangerous. The question about proceeding was settled for him. The boat, although in mid-channel, ran her stem into the mud. With a falling tide, it would have been madness to proceed farther. "Back all!" cried the lieutenant. There was barely room for the oars between the two banks. It seemed doubtful at first whether the boat could be shoved off. Delay in this case, as it is in many others, was dangerous. Paddy Adair and several of the men on this instantly leaped out, but sank very nearly up to their middles in slime and water. With their weight, however, out of her, the boat floated, and the rest standing up and shoving at the same time, they got her a little way down the stream. Paddy, who was always ready to do anything, however unpleasant, for the sake of setting an example, continued in the water, shoving the boat along, the black banks on either side showing the importance of getting out of the trap into which they had gone as quickly as possible. "Jump in, Adair, jump in! She'll freely swim now," said Hemming. "We'll just get her past this log of wood and give her a shove off from it," said Paddy, making a spring on a dark brown object close to them. He jumped off again, however, very much faster, and sprang towards the boat, for the seeming log opened a huge pair of jaws, exhibiting a terrific row of teeth, with which it made a furious snap at the midshipman's legs. Happily, Mr. Hemming, leaning over, caught him by the arm and dragged him in, while one of the men gave the monster a rap with the end of his oar, which somewhat distracted his attention, and allowed the rest of the men to scramble on board, which they did in a very great hurry, and no little consternation exhibited in their looks. The alligator first vented his rage by gnawing the blade of the oar, and then made a terrific rush at the boat. "Shove away, my lad, shove away!" cried Hemming, not wishing to waste time in a contest with the beast. The men, standing up, urged on the boat with their oars as fast as they could, but the savage brute still followed, biting at the blades and trying to get in between them. Terence, however, who very speedily recovered from his alarm, seized a musket, and, watching for the moment when the alligator next opened his huge mouth, fired right down it. "A hard pill that is to digest, if it does not kill him," cried Paddy when he had done the deed. At first the brute seemed scarcely aware that anything unusual had gone down his throat, but as he was making another dart at the boat, he suddenly began to move about in an eccentric way, as Paddy said, as if something troubled him on his inside, and then, turning away, buried his huge body in the mud, while his tail lashed the water into foam. Round the spot above where his head was probably hidden, a red circle was formed, which, whirling round in the eddies of the current, came sweeping past the boat, proving that Adair's shot had not failed to take effect. Well content to get thus easily rid of their unpleasant antagonist, the men shaved the boat on rapidly down the creek. They had not quite come in sight of the slave schooner when a shout reached their ears. It was repeated. It sounded like a cry for help. "It's Murray's voice, sir," exclaimed Adair. "He's shouting to us. He is attacked, depend on it." So Mr. Hemming thought. The boat was got round. The men sprang into their seats, and getting out their oars, dashed away down the stream. The sound of several pistol shots reached their ears and increased their eagerness to get on. They soon came in sight of the schooner. Murray and his two companions were on her deck and keeping at bay a dozen Spaniards and blacks, who were attempting to force their way across the platform. Several other people were coming up, and in another instant Murray and the two seamen would have been overpowered. Even when united, the Englishmen were far outnumbered by the Spaniards and blacks. Murray heard the shout of his friends as they drew near, and it encouraged him to persevere in his hitherto almost hopeless defense of the prize. In another instant the boat dashed alongside. The crew quickly scrambled on board, and, whirling their cutlasses round their heads, with loud shouts they charged the enemy, and drove them off the platform. They next set to work to cut it away. They were not long about it. Not a moment was to be lost. More people were coming up, blacks and whites, armed with muskets. The warps which moored the vessel to the shore were speedily cut. 3 hands jumped into the boat, and the end of a hawser being heaved to them, they towed round the schooner's head. The current caught it and helped them. Meantime the topsails were loosed and the jib run up. A puff of wind also came down the creek. Away glided the schooner. The boat dropped alongside. The slave dealers, now mustering strong, began firing at them. They fired in return, so as to drive the villains to seek shelter behind the trees. It might well have enraged the Spaniards to see their vessel carried away from before their very eyes. They did their best to revenge themselves by trying to pick off the Englishmen, but though 2 of the latter were slightly wounded, no one was disabled, and the schooner held her course unimpeded down the stream. Our friends found, however, before long, in one of the reaches, the wind heading them, and looking astern, they saw that several large canoes and other boats had put out from the shore, and were in pursuit of them. The slavers probably calculated on their getting on shore to enable them to come up with them. The current, however, was strong, the wind was tolerably steady, the schooner went about like a top, and a few tacks carried them through each of the reaches when the wind headed them. Thus they made good way, but still there were many dangers to be encountered. They might, for the present, easily keep ahead of their pursuers, but unless they could get a free wind to cross the bar, they must bring up, as it would otherwise be madness to make the attempt. They had gone a long way up the river, and it was difficult to say how the wind might be at the mouth. At last, in a long reach, they ran the pirates out of sight. They, however, suspected that the latter were stopping to collect more of their forces before coming on the attack. At length, the schooner reached the main channel of the river. Hemming and Murray and Adair looked anxiously up the other stream in hopes of seeing Mr. Evans' boat.
"Perhaps she has come down, and will be waiting for us at the bar," observed Hemming. "If she has got a hold of the schooner we were looking for, we shall very likely find her ahead of us. At all events, we must keep on till we find her."
The little vessel was accordingly kept on down the river. Great was their disappointment, on coming in sight of the bar, to find a heavy surf breaking over it, while the breeze which came in set very nearly up the stream. It was absolutely necessary to bring up. The anchor was dropped, and as the vessel swung to the tide, the dark waters came whirling and eddying by with a force which made Hemming thankful that he had not attempted to cross the bar. As soon as they had brought up, he made every preparation for defending the vessel from the attack to be expected. Having got all their arms ready, he had ropes passed round and round the vessel above the bulwarks, so as to serve in the place of boarding nettings, and then, not without great difficulty, they hoisted their own boat on board, and stowed her amidships. These important preparations being made, they lighted the fire in the caboose and cooked a dinner, for which an abundance of provisions was found on board. A couple of hours passed away. They were anxious ones to Hemming, so they were to Murray, and perhaps to Adair, though the men did not probably trouble themselves much about the matter. A constant lookout, however, was being kept up the river, lest the pirates should come on them unawares, and down the river, in hopes of seeing the surf diminishing on the bar and the wind set more out of it. What could have become of Mr. Evans, Rogers, and their party was also the constant subject of conversation.
"Hurrah!" at last cried Murray, who had been looking out astern. "The bottom's getting quite smooth. See, there is scarcely any current passing us, and the wind is setting almost out of the river."
"And here come the canoes in battle array," cried Adair from forward. "They'll be down upon us before many minutes are over."
"Heave up the anchor, my lads," shouted Hemming. "Let fall the topsails. Run up the jib and forestaysail. Set the foresail and mainsail."
These orders followed in rapid succession. The men did not require to be told to be smart about the work. Round came the schooner's head, her sails filled, and, under complete command, she stood towards the bar. A clear piece of water showed the only passage she could take with safety. The slave traders' fleet of canoes came on, but they were just in time to be too late. The schooner stood on, and while piloted, dashed through the dangerous passage, the surf boiling up still on either side, but not breaking on board her. In another minute she was over it, and floating free in the open ocean. The brig was at a considerable distance, in chase of a vessel in the offing, but there was no sign of the other boat, or of the schooner, which it was hoped she might have captured. Not knowing the sad fate of Mr. Evans and his party, Murray and Adair were eagerly on the lookout for them. Occasionally they turned a glance astern to see what had become of their pursuers, but the pirates seemed to have considered it useless or too hazardous to attempt to cross the bar, and had given up the chase. "I say, Alec, what do you make out that dark object to be there?" exclaimed Adair, pointing to the southward. One after the other examined it through the glass. "It's a whale or a ship's bottom," answered Murray. After a long scrutiny, they reported what they had seen to Hemming.
"No whales likely to have floated into these latitudes," he remarked. "Some vessel must have been capsized. Keep her away towards it.
The schooner with a fair breeze rapidly approached the object they had seen. It was soon ascertained that Hemming was right in his conjectures. They got close up to the wreck. There was no one on her.
By the set of the current here, I judge she may have come over the very bar we've just crossed. Not very long ago, either, observed Hemming, thoughtfully.
Twice he sailed round the wreck, examining her narrowly.
I'm afraid something has happened, he observed at last. I'm not happy on the subject. I cannot be helped, though. It may be the lot of any of us. Keep her up once more for the brig.
Alec and Terence became very sad when they heard these remarks. They scarcely liked to ask Hemming what he meant. As they talked over the matter, they felt very much alarmed on Jack's account. Still, they could not believe that he, their old friend and companion, could possibly be lost. No, he'll turn up somewhere, I'm sure, cried Paddy. I trust he will, answered Alec gravely. But he felt very sad and depressed in spirits. Hemming seemed doubtful what to do, whether he would cross the bar, make a dash at the pirates, and run up the river and look for his friends, or stand on at once and get greater force from the brig. The latter was the wisest course, and he determined to follow it. The Archer had stood away in chase of another vessel of a suspicious appearance, and when night fell she was nowhere to be seen. Hemming, therefore, hove the schooner to wait till her return. Had he gone after her, they might very probably in the darkness of night have missed each other. Never, perhaps, had my two old schoolfellows passed a more anxious night. Even when they were wrecked on the coast of Greece, then the three friends were together. Now their minds were racked with doubts of the most painful description as to what had become of Jack and his companions. Had they known of the destruction of the boat and her crew, they would, if possible, have been still more anxious. Hemming also kept pacing the deck all night long, looking out on every side. Like a good officer, as he was, who felt that the lives of the people with him were entrusted to his care, he did not dread any attack from boats, but he knew that armed slavers might be attempting to run in or out of the river while the brig was away, and that if they attempted to molest him, he should find them very difficult customers to dispose of. Still, he was not the man to allow a slaver to pass him without attempting to capture her, inferior as he might be to her in force. The night was very dark. Now and then a few flashes of phosphorescent light played over the ocean, or were stirred up by the bows of the schooner as she slowly worked her way through the water. But even the sharpest eyes on board could scarcely distinguish anything 200 or 300 yards off. Terence and Alec could not bring themselves to lie down nor to take any rest, even though Hemming urged them to do so. They were leaning together over the bulwarks. They neither of them could have said whether they were asleep or awake. The wind had dropped considerably, and at intervals the sails shook themselves and gave a loud flap against the masts. Terence felt a hand suddenly resting on his shoulder. "What is that? Do you hear a sound? Do you see anything?" said a voice in his ear. The voice appeared so deep and hollow and strange that he did not at first discover that it was Murray speaking to him. Alec repeated the question twice before he replied. He had, in truth, been fast asleep, but he did not know it. "No, what? See here, what? I don't see anything," was his somewhat incoherent answer. "There it is again. Music. Someone singing," continued Alec. "Can you see nothing?" The two midshipmen peered eagerly out into the darkness, but nothing could they discern. They, however, drew Hemming's attention to the circumstance. He had been walking the deck, so the noise of his own footsteps prevented him from hearing the sound. He now listened with them, but after some time, hearing nothing, was inclined to think that they had been deceived by their fancy. Murray thought not, and, keeping his eyes on the point from which he believed the sounds had come, was almost certain that he could distinguish the sails of a square-rigged vessel passing at no great distance off, standing in towards the coast. He called Hemming's attention to it, but whether or not the night mists had at that moment he was looking lifted up and again sunk down, and allowed him to see a vessel really there, or that his fancy still misled him, it was impossible to say. Certainly no sail was to be seen, nor was the sound again heard. Slowly the hours of that night seemed to pass away. Day came at last, a gloomy coast of Africa morning, with a thick, damp, ague and fever-giving fog. In vain they looked out for the Archer. They began to fear that she might have followed the vessel after which she had gone in chase to a considerable distance, thus delaying the expedition they were so anxious to undertake in search of the other boat. As the sun rose, however, his rays began a struggle with the mist, and, aided by a light breeze which sprang up from the northward, finally triumphed, and rolling off their adversary, they beamed forth on the dancing blue waters and on the white canvas of the brig, which came gliding on majestically towards them, followed by another vessel, which she had overtaken and captured. The prize had half a cargo of slaves on board, and was on her way up to another place where her owners had agents to complete it. The first question which Alec and Terence asked on getting on board the Archer was for Rogers and the other boat's crew. Their hearts sank within them when they found that nothing had been seen of the boat. Captain Grant listened to all the information that they could give, and promptly formed a plan, the execution of which he entrusted to Hemming and the 2 midshipmen, complimenting them at the same time for the gallant way in which they had captured the slaver and brought her out of the river. End of chapter 12. Recording by TJP 1421.